The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
That's job rotation.
Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Sharon Dooley. I'm going to moderate the session today. We have an interesting topic, SQL Farms, converting legacy SQL servers to SQL as a service. This is the wave of the future. Our presenter is Sarah Barella from Microsoft, and I'd like to thank Dell Software for sponsoring us. It's Dell that makes it possible for us to have a giveaway, a raffle every session, and we would not be able to do that without their help. If you don't know about SQL Saturday, find out. It's a one-day free training event. They're all over the world. This is just a list of the ones that are coming up in the near future. They're everywhere. You can find out more about them at www.sqlsaturday.com. There's bound to be one that's near you. And as I said, it's an absolutely free day of training, bunch of sessions, bunch of tracks. Might ask you to pay $10 for lunch. The Tazz Business Analytics Conference is coming up at the April 20th through 22nd in Santa Clara, California. If you are registered, use the BAVCDB code when you register. That'll save you $150. And the virtual chapter that gets the most registrations will get a free pass to the conference to raffle off. For Summit, the Performance chapter won, and I'm planning that the DBA VC is going to win this time. This is just one of many virtual chapters. It may not be the only one you're interested in. You just go to Pass and sign up, and you'll get mailings from the other virtual chapters when they're having sessions. Pass is an all-volunteer organization. Yes, there's paid staff in headquarters and running the website and stuff like that. But all of the work of the organization is done by volunteers. You can volunteer in many ways. And there's a monthly Outstanding Volunteer Award. And at the Community Summit, there will be one volunteer will be presented with the Passion Award. If you're not already a member, please join and stay in touch with us. I wanted to just tell you a little bit about Sarah, our presenter. She's a data platform technical specialist for Microsoft and focusing on cloud and service providers. She's been a SQL Server DBA for more than 15 years. And has specialized in the administration of environments with large number of SQL Server instances. Her recent interests lie in applying cloud technologies to SQL Server. Sarah has spoken at the Summit several times and frequently speaks at SQL Saturdays in the Midwest. And so now I'm going to turn it over to Sarah and let her do her thing.
Thank you, Sharon. I'm going to show my screen right now. I hope everyone can see that. It's very nice to be here. I've been a member of PASS for a long time, and I always appreciate the opportunity to speak to the community. Today, I am going to speak on SQL Server Farms, converting legacy SQL servers to SQL as a service. I'm going to talk a lot about what does the as a service mean, and how do you really apply the cloud technologies to your environment, taking the learnings that I've had from working in service providers and working with service providers, and I think they're applicable to almost every environment. So let's go ahead and get started. Come next. So Sharon did a great job of introducing me. I think that has that everything was covered, but I did want to say that I did spend prior to joining Microsoft, I spent 8 years working at a service provider. And one of the things that I did was I created I started with a SQL as a service offering, and then I worked and created a database as a service offering. At one time, I was managing about 8,000 databases by myself. Over time, I was able to hire like a half a DBA to help. But when you're working in these sorts of environments, you have to kind of learn tricks to manage the large environment and apply a lot of automation. I'm going to share some of that with you today. This isn't a very deep technical. I'm not going to get into the weeds on how to configure your SQL servers, but more an overall architecture so that we can kind of talk about all the things that are involved with kind of changing the way you think about managing your environment. So on the agenda today, I want to talk a little bit about thinking like a service provider. Service providers have to be generally very efficient. And what is a service provider cloud provider? What does as a service mean? We hear as a service attached to everything. So I'm going to kind of define how I talk about as a service, and specifically related to SQL Server. Also, we'll get into sort of the layered approach to these as a service technologies. Truthfully, SQL Server, there's not a ton that you have to do to configure SQL Server to act as a service. A lot of the service and the automation happens at a lower level. So I'm going to talk about all the other things from the hypervisor up, your automation systems that are needed to make a service work. I'm also going to talk about some automation strategies, how to think about SQL Server. And then finally, I will talk a little bit about those specific features in SQL Server that really make the as-a-service work and is secure. So to begin with, what is a service provider, and who are these people? Service providers have been around for a very long time, and you can think about it. Maybe 5 years ago, a service provider might have been called a hoster. But over time, we sort of changed what we think of as a service provider. We also call this a cloud provider. And essentially, a cloud provider is a Microsoft partner who offers Microsoft products in a consumable way. So it's another way to consume a Microsoft product. So you can go to a cloud provider and buy a Windows VM or a website, perhaps. Also, it could be a software as a service company. As we become more mobile and with the kind of the explosion of apps, a lot of companies are wanting to offer their products instead of like a packaged product that you have to buy and somebody sends you a CD. People just want to be able to go to a website or use an app and experience the software. Well, the back end of that software, it needs to be what we call hosted. It needs to live somewhere. And Microsoft does have their own cloud platform. I'm sure everybody is familiar with Azure. But there is a realization at Microsoft that not everything is going to live in Azure. Azure, while it has a ton of features and functionalities, it doesn't meet the needs of every customer. Sometimes you might have specific compliance requirements that don't allow you to move to Azure. Or maybe your application is still running on Windows 2003 and you just can't get away from it. You're not going to be able to move to Azure. But there's this whole world of service providers who focus on niches, like there are financial services cloud providers who understand that particular niche, have all the compliance requirements that you could go to. There's also, lots of people have big environments. All companies have invested for many years in their own infrastructure, and there is a recognition that they're not going to move overnight to a service provider or to Azure. And so the strategy that we have is the cloud platform strategy, and it basically means that there's a consistent platform across wherever your Microsoft experience is, whether you're using Azure or at a service provider or even in your own world. And so what I'm going to, today I hope to kind of share with you this consistent platform into your database world. So as we have known, I don't know where I got this slide. I have seen everywhere. It's sort of ubiquitous now. So I don't even know who to give credit for. But when we see everything as a service, we've now even seen, pizza as a service, which I think is a wonderful way that's very approachable for people to think about what the as a service, the cloud, sort of is, and how the different areas, how the different offerings, the different ases are separated out. And so this, traditional pizza as a service does a very good job. We have our traditional, just, how we've been running SQL servers forever. And then there is IaaS. And the way that I generally think of IaaS in terms of SQL Server is that if you go to a service provider or maybe your own internal IT staff and you say, hey, I need a Windows server. They provide you with a Windows server. They provide you the power, maybe the storage, the networking to that server, but that's about it. You are responsible for installing SQL Server, for patching it, making sure that it's configured correctly, and that's pretty much all you have. And I think that's how a lot of people experience SQL Server, that they sort of own that whole experience. But in today's sort of world of trying to become more efficient, we are looking at, so how can I take that, installing SQL Server, kind of a chore, pretty much everyone has their own way of doing this, but if you could take that, just the steps, sometimes it can take hours if you have to apply all the patches to your SQL Server and get that server immediately. And that's sort of what I think of as platform as a service, where when you need a new SQL Server, you just say, hey, I need a new SQL Server, and one is spun up for you immediately. The service provider or the IT department takes care of installing that SQL Server, patching it, making sure it's secure, and everything sort of below that. You can create your databases. And that's what I think of as SQL as a service. And then finally is software as a service. This is what, if you're familiar with Azure, SQL Azure is a software as a service. But you can still have that same software as experience in your environment by offering database as a service. And what this is where you just give an end user a database. They don't have SA rights, they can't configure the server, no changes, they just get access to a single database. And so when we're thinking about as a service, a lot of people think, oh, I'm just going to virtualize my SQL Server and now I have a cloud or a service offering. Unfortunately, it's not quite that easy. There are a couple of things that are really required of as a service. And I think the most important is that it needs to be on demand and scalable, that you need to be able to say, hey, I need a service. You click a button or you make a phone call and you have that database immediately. And that's one of the things that the cloud has made people expect, that no longer is it acceptable for it to take 3, 6, 8 weeks for a SQL Server to be built. That now your executives are going to say, hey, why does it take us 8 weeks to build a SQL Server when I can go to a service provider or Azure and have that server in 6 or 7 minutes? And so we need to think when we're talking about our own internal IT is how do we How can we get that efficient? And the customer is not required to do the installation, the patching, the updating, the maintenance, the upgrades. All of that is handled by someone else so that you can really focus on what's important to you, what you know best. And in a lot of cases, that's the application and supporting the database, whether you're a performance DBA or a development DBA. Instead of having to, take a day out of your life and install SQL Server, now you can focus more on the things that are important to your company. Now, fine-grained metering, I'll be honest with you, there's going to be some things in my presentation that I'm going to tell you not to do or that I'm not a big fan of. Fine-grained metering, I feel, is an option in the cloud. In some organizations, there's chargebacks where the IT department charges the accounting department for its services. That's not always, a lot of organizations don't operate that way, and it might not be necessary. But one of the nice things is that now within SQL Server, we can do that fine-grained metering. So if your organization does charge the accounting department and they, at the end of the month, do these runaway reports and, hog your servers, that now you can charge them for that instead of, kind of estimating what their actual usage. There's a certain service level of commitment that when you are offering as a service. Now, I don't necessarily believe that every as a service offering needs to be 100% HA. In some cases, it'll be okay if that server is at 99% available. That on the weekends you can do patching, no one's working on it, and that shouldn't be treated the same way as a mission-critical system that maybe is doing life support for somebody. That there is different kinds of services. I think this is also a good time to mention that when you're thinking about your service that you are going to offer your users or customers, that I always like to go with the 80-20 rule. When I'm going to talk about some things and you're going to think, well, that won't work for this particular database. It might not. But what we're trying to do is help focus all of those maybe 80% of your databases. Let's move that into an automated system so that you actually have time for those problem databases that you have or those very sensitive servers. You don't have to worry about all the stuff that just kind of runs. And finally, self-service. That having to provide someone a backup or having to create a new database for a customer, create a new user. These are things that when are requested, you have to stop what you're doing and go and do it. And if you have an automated system that allows your developers to do this themselves, they will be much happier and you won't have those interruptions. I've never met a DBA that says, oh, I have plenty of time to do my job. Everybody is always like, there's more work than I possibly can do in a day. So if you can start offloading some of the smaller tasks, maybe that, hey, occasionally you will check off your whole to-do list, which is where you want to go. My goal when I was working at a service provider was that I wanted to automate myself out of the job. That didn't happen, thankfully, but that was sort of my mentality, that I was always trying to save, a few minutes wherever I could. So I wanted to provide sort of we talked briefly earlier about the different as-a-services. There's the database as a service, which is really, you're getting at the database level, multi-tenancy. And the key to as-a-service really is multi-tenancy. That is where you're achieving cost savings. And so when your executive and leadership teams are looking at saying, hey, I guarantee you people are talking to them about, going to Azure or going to a service provider. And they're going to be talking about how much more efficient and cost-effective it is to run on those platforms. What I suggest is that we need to look at how do we make your platforms and your environment just as cost-effective. And the best way to do that is with multi-tenancy and putting more than one database in a SQL Server used by multiple people gives you the highest level of density and the highest cost savings. So as many databases that you can run in one SQL Server is going to give you the greatest cost savings, because remember, you also are paying for your licensing, and with a lot of software, it's per server and per core, and so the more density you can get, the more cost savings. Now, there's also, but like I said, not every database can live in a multi-tenant environment where they are sharing with a neighbor. They may need to do things like access the operating system or run DTS packages, or I'm sorry, SSIS packages. Did I just show my age there? I think I did. SSIS packages that that just aren't a fit for a database as a service. Well, in that case, what I suggest is that we think about it as SQL as a service. We are going to provide you that platform as a service experience by giving you a SQL Server instance instead. Now, there are also companies out there that are doing big data and BI as a service. I'm not going to kind of get into that technology too much. Truthfully, that is not where my expertise lives, but it is a very interesting sort of thinking of taking our database engine and then also applying it to analysis services. I separate high availability out of my as a service. I think of high availability as an add-on. Not every database needs to be 100% HA, but some of them do. And thinking about how you design your systems, you might not, I don't think that there's a one-size-fits-all for every company. You might have a combination of database as a service with SQL as a service, with one of your databases as a service servers being HA, others not. So we're going to think of availability services as a sort of an add-on. So I wanted to start with our sort of regular SQL Server, where you have a database, you have any configuration, all is owned by that database. And there are some, especially you have those older applications, you might not be able to move them to a multi-tenant, database as a service because they were written a long time ago, and they meant, I've seen applications still today that require the SA as, a login. You can't use that in a shared environment. And so, just a SQL Server might just meet those needs. Also, I am a huge fan of virtualization. I believe, truthfully, every SQL Server should be virtualized. Well, I would say 99% of SQL Servers should be virtualized. I have run across the SQL Server that, it just doesn't make sense. So in those cases, we're just kind of talking about, just a regular old dedicated SQL Server. Sometimes I'll refer to this as a hosted SQL Server. But that brings me to SQL as a service, and that really happens at the instance level. Now, this slide here has a couple of references to sort of multiple instances on a SQL Server. I am not a fan of the multiple instances. It becomes very hard to manage when you have a large environment with connection strings and the like, and making sure that people are pointing to the right instance. I prefer a single instance per Windows operating system. That is generally what I recommend. And in that case, you have all the benefits of it, but then you also don't have to worry about governing CPU, memory, and disk. Let the operating system handle that, your virtual machine handle that, and then your SQL Server can just do what it does. And in these cases, there are very popular databases and services offering out there in the market that offer a SQL Server instance that you don't have to share it with anybody else, but you don't have access to the underlying operating system. And that's sort of key in the security of the SQL as a service environment. So when you think of this, this is a very good option for those pesky databases that just can't be multi-tenant. However, if you can treat them the same way you treat a database as a service instance, you can still save the same efficiency. The ability to spin it up, spin it down, add resources, add CPU very quickly. You still are getting some of the benefits. And if SQL Enterprise Edition has service, oh, I can't do that, it's not secure. I'm going to show you that it is secure. It might not meet every compliance standard, and it might not be the right choice for everybody, but it is a secure option. Also, we're going to talk about noisy neighbor, and that is one of the biggest concerns when you are talking about database as a service. You're worried about, hey, if I'm on a server with another database, they can, what if they have a terrible database? And this thing is just using all the CPU, I'm not going to have any room. Well, we'll talk about the resource governor and how you can use that to control your noisy neighbor problems and all the different ways that the resource governor can be configured in your offering. So at this point, I kind of talked about the world of as a service in terms of SQL Server, and I wanted to get into sort of the foundation of the SQL SQL as a service. And that really what makes SQL as a service is really how it's configured under the covers. And when you're thinking about designing out an as a service architecture, there's a couple of things to think about, your compute and networking. And truthfully, I think that you have to do this reasonably. I know many years ago when people started virtualizing SQL servers and doing consolidation, they thought, oh, I can take 20 servers and put it on a server with 8 cores and everything would be fine. And they had a bad experience. One of the things is you have to think about what your databases are. What do they look like? What is the profile of those databases? And one thing that I've noticed is, I encourage you to do a profile of all of your databases. Where they live, how much CPU, how much memory are they using, how much disk are they doing, and put them into groups. And you might be able to see some patterns of how the databases are being consumed, and then you'll be able to size the service appropriately. Storage. One of the pushbacks that I often hear is, oh, well, we have to configure our SQL Server for logs and our data files, our indexes, and we have their own drives. And then a lot of times people are doing this on these big, extensive, intelligent SANs, where the SAN is doing all of this smart work for you, kind of defeating the purpose of the SQL Server. I kind of believe let your operating system do what it does best, let your storage do what it does best, and in this case, like I said, we're talking about those 80% of databases. For 80% of databases, they can get by more than well on, a single storage, a single drive, not without having to divide it up. However, perhaps you have a number of applications that do need separate, or you don't have super fancy SAN. In those cases, you can still have multiple databases using that. And a lot of times I've seen database as a service offerings where you can go in and pick, this database is going to have its data on this drive, this database is going to have its logs on this drive, indexes on this drive, and backups on this other slow storage. Depending on your needs, you can create systems that mimic what you need. HA and SLA. You need to go in when you're thinking about this is what is going to be my SLAs. This server 99%, this server 99.9999, and that way you can design accordingly. Performance, We were talking about that earlier a little bit with the resource governor, and that's really how we're going to control the performance to making sure that there's a consistent experience, as well as security. You have to understand what the compliance needs are for your organization. How is this database accessed? If it's only used internally, you'll have a different set of security requirements rather than if the server is accessed some way via the internet or publicly. And as well as licensing is extremely important when you are designing these systems. We can't overlook the fact that, let's be honest, that SQL Server is expensive. Enterprise Edition is expensive, and designing your system so that you can maximize your licenses. So I think of this as sort of a layered approach. You have a physical server with your compute, your storage, your networking. And I am going to talk about HyperV because truthfully I'm in this sort of weird place where I have never used another hypervisor. I've only worked with HyperV, so I know it best. But I think that you can translate when I say HyperV to another platform or another hypervisor. It's all the same principle behind it. But so I think of you have your underlying physical server, and then you put on top of that a hypervisor. And that hypervisor is what's going to give you a lot of the flexibility on the underlying system. It gives you the flexibility to spin things up very quickly, allows a lot of the automation, and gives you a basic level of disaster recovery. And then we have our virtual machine with our SQL Server. And we can access this through, all the traditional ways that we do it, and I'm going to give you a new way to access your SQL Server, the Windows Azure Pack, which we'll talk about in a few minutes. But all of this is sort of the layered approach to database as a service. Now, I always want to start this presentation out with talking a little bit about virtualizing SQL Server. 5 years, well, probably more than 5. Maybe 7 or 8 years ago, if you asked me, we're going to virtualize all your SQL servers, I would have said, you're crazy. You are not touching my SQL servers. You are not virtualizing them. That is a terrible idea. Well, the world has changed, thankfully, in the last few years, and now I am moved completely the other way. For me, the benefits of virtualization far outweigh the negative, and we'll talk a little bit about that in a second. The ability, if you have a problem SQL Server or there's an underlying issue with hardware, being able to live migrate that virtual machine to another server without an outage is huge. You no longer have to worry, okay, wait a minute, we have to take backups, restore this whole machine. No, we're just going to move that virtual machine over. That ability to do that is enormous. So like I said, I am willing to put up with any sort of risk to be able to have that sort of ability to manage my SQL Server. SQL Server can support, or the physical host, up to 4 terabytes of memory, a virtual machine, 1 terabyte. I work with customers that have, need 4 terabytes of memory for their SQL servers. This might not be a solution, but when we're looking at that 80-20 rule, I strongly encourage everyone to look at virtualizing those SQL servers. Another concern was about NUMA Architecture, non-uniform memory access, and that's really the processor and the memory, talking to each other, which is very high level. But SQL Server is optimized for that, and HyperV aligns to the VM and the host so that it does support NUMA, which for some people that was a hold off while they were when they were thinking about virtualizing their SQL servers. I recently attended a training session, and the question was, how should you think about your SQL servers when they're virtualized? And the answer was, you treat them the exact same way as you do physical servers. So that, remember, SQL Server does not know that it lives in a virtual environment. It only knows the Windows operating system. And that, the guidance that I have received is that you treat them the same way. Now, I do have in the appendix of this presentation, there's a performance load testing slide that shows you, how SQL Server performs in a virtualized environment. But the one thing that I really wanted to show out of that is in the middle there. I guess you can't see me pointing at my screen, but trust me, I'm pointing at the 6% difference between a physical and a virtual SQL Server. So what is the overhead of virtualizing your SQL Server? In this test, we showed that it was 6% difference, and that's really along the lines of what I see with working with customers. Truthfully, I rarely see a SQL Server that is maxed out. Most people scale them over provisioned SQL Servers. And that 6% they can more than well, absorb, and it is worth the cost of virtualizing your SQL Server for the benefits that you get. So when talking about virtualizing your SQL servers within HyperV and most hypervisors, we have failover clustering. And so that's when I was talking about the ability to move VMs between machines. Well, you can do that from live migration. But I also suggest clustering, and this gives you a hardware level protection. So if you have a hardware problem on a server, that failover clustering just at the virtual machine level will give you that hardware protection. And then you can also layer on top of that failover clustering inside of the SQL Server. Now, I always like to point this out, but SQL Server Always On is a brand name. It includes failover clustering and always on availability groups. I've noticed in the community and in the world, always on tends to refer to just availability groups, but in this case I am talking about the failover clustering. I am not a huge fan of using SQL Server clustering in a database or a SQL as a service environment, just because your hardware protection is done by the virtual machine clustering, and then you can use other technologies, always on availability groups, to give you what I think is a better protection for your database. Now, however, I'm a DBA, so I have to use the word "it depends." It depends. You might have those large SAN environments. If you have lots and lots, 10 terabytes of data, you can't have two. I understand. You have to have one back-end storage. You can't have two copies of that database. But in general, for that 80-20% of the rule, I think the VM level clustering is where I stop. It does add some complexity if you're using SQL Server clustering, because you want to make sure that your VMs are not on the same physical server, because it doesn't give you much of a protection if you have your physical server has a failover and you have to know where the if both nodes are on the same physical machine, you don't have very much protection. However, I know in the virtual machine manager, that is managed for you. So I prefer using always on availability groups. And one of the reasons that I like availability groups is that when you're doing always an as a service offering, especially at the database level, one trick that I used was that I gave each database its own domain, fully qualified domain name, and just an alias, an A record alias, and so that I can move that database around wherever I wanted to move it without having the customers have to make, or your end users making application changes, especially those old applications where they have, they actually have the connection string in every line of code and they have to make thousands of updates. if you give somebody a connection string that you then could update on the back end, it makes your life a whole lot easier. And with the listener and always on availability groups, I tend to like to use that alias as the listener. And so not only am I, controlling the availability group, but also at that higher level. I'm not going to get into the inner workings of availability groups, but one of the benefits of availability groups is that you can have secondary replicas. If in your SQL Server farm that you may have servers that are sitting there just as failovers. You're already paying for the enterprise license. You can use those replicas as read-only. And so when you mix workloads where you have some failover, some are primary databases, you can achieve, it can make economic sense to be able to use the always-on availability groups for those secondaries. And gives you a little bit of breathing room, and then you can run your backups off of it. You can have your reporting off of it. A lot of times I've been seeing availability groups being used not so much, the HA benefit is wonderful, but also to sort of horizontally scale their database. You have all the reads going to one database, all the writes to the other, and you can achieve sort of greater efficiency with your hardware. So now you do need 2 copies of the database, and that is a negative. But remember, we're talking about that 80-20 rule, and let's be honest, you have a lot of small databases and a couple of really big ones. And so that's where I'm thinking about this. And so all of this also can be automated, and that you also can group them together and move them as a group. So now I sort of wanted to get into the delivering that as a service. And through the System Center, I'm going to talk about System Center because it's what I know. I know that there are other automation tools out there, but one of the things that makes this as a service is the ability to automate and being able to go and request a new environment, to request a new instance without having that human interaction. Another benefit of that is every time you build a SQL Server by hand, it may be a little bit different. As much as we have our standards and our practices, people can make mistakes. And when you automate it, those mistakes are reduced greatly. So through the System Center Service Manager, you can totally request new databases, new virtual instances. You can customize offers. For instance, if you have a particular application where it maybe needs many databases and it needs to be configured in a very specific way, that you can have, hey, I need a new accounting reporting database, and it knows the specific configuration that you already have. So this is System Center Orchestra, and you can use Orchestra. It's really your automation tool, and in this case it just goes and you can create your own. How are we going to do this? Is this a shared database? Is this a multi-tenant at the database level? Well, yes it is. Does it need HA? Yes. So then you have to move down to the next one. And then, or if it is a dedicated environment with HA, remember, you can use this automation on physical servers too, or just at the virtual level. And then it will go through this and set it up for you. I also set my database as a service offering up to know when it needed a new database by using monitoring. The System Center, or let's see, what is that, SCOM, Operations Manager. I would know that if a server got to, it was using 50% of its CPU, that I knew that when that server, we wanted to keep the servers right around 60% CPU on average. So at 50% CPU, I would spin up a new server so that it would be ready to go once that 60% was reached. Any task, because I had so much to do and it was just me, I had a rule. Anytime, I didn't want to do anything 3 times. So the first time I get a request, go ahead and do it. Second time I get a request, It might take me a little bit longer, but let's figure out a way that I can automate this. Write a PowerShell script. Create an Orchestra run book to prevent that from happening. For instance, one of the things that I know is that, when backup failures happened, about 75% of the time it's because one of two things. Somebody had taken the database offline or there was a network problem. So what we did was create an automation script to go in, say, is the database online? If it's not, turn it online. If it is, let's just rerun the backup before it alerts me and I have to take action. And those are the kinds of ways when you're thinking about running an as-a-service offering, you want to think of how much can you automate into your system. How many error messages do you get? Let's think, how do we automate the correction of that before an actual DBA has to take action? Virtual Machine Manager allows you to create templates so that you can just click a button and spin up a new virtual machine. And it can have the SQL Server VM already in there. So we talked a little bit, I did mention the automation for SQL Server related events. This one here is an example of evaluating indexes. A lot of times what happens is that we'll just rebuild every index, once a week, regardless of, what's going on. Sometimes indexes need to be rebuilt more often than that. You also have to take into account the load the databases have. All of that you can start to automate, because if you have monitoring on your system, then you can start using that information and making intelligent systems that self-heal. It was really the goal. And you can find that when I left when I left the service provider, I think there were some servers I hadn't logged into in 6-7 months. Most of the systems I never touched because we had them just running the way that we wanted them to run. And that's really the goal, so that you can operate as efficiently as possible. And then instead of spending time, fixing, no one wants to fix backups. No one does. And so then you can spend your time doing things like, I love performance tuning, and I would love to spend my time doing performance tuning rather than fixing a backup. So now this brings me to the Windows Azure Pack. Now this is the old version of the Azure portal, but this is the new version. Came out, I think it was like 1st of February. But on the right here we have the Windows Azure Pack. The Windows Azure Pack is a free download that anybody can just go and download that gives you an Azure-like experience, a portal that you can run in your own environment. You can customize this, you can skin it to make it look like yours, put your company's logo on that, where no one would know that, that it's the Windows Azure Pack. It is also behind this is a set of APIs that you can use to call into your system. And so the Windows Azure Pack is what makes that consistent platform experience. Now there is a new version for both the Azure Pack and for the Azure portal with the new slick environment. But what the Azure Pack does is that it allows you to have that self-server user experience. When I was talking about having to create a database as a service with creating your templates and all of that, you can do that in Azure Pack. We've been able to spin up these environments in less than a day using the Windows Azure Pack, and that you can have your own database as a service offering, probably, Friday if you wanted to, because the self-server portal is all built into Azure Pack. And what it comes with is, you can do the same thing for websites, virtual machines, and database as a service. You can do it with whether you just want to give somebody a SQL Server or their own database. There's also service level management APIs that if your developers just want to, write to an API to spin up a database, they can do so. And the Azure Pack is a really cool tool. I don't think a lot of people know about it outside of service providers, but it can be used in any IT environment. So now I wanted to spend the last few minutes that we have on SQL Server configurations. There are really two things that you have to consider when you're doing an as-a-service offering. The first is what we call the predictable performance. You want to have, when a user comes and uses your platform, if one day it's super fast and the next day it's super slow, they're not going to be happy. And the way that we manage this is using the resource governor. And this is something that, before it was very, very difficult to offer as a service before we had the resource governor. In the resource governor, you can govern CPU, memory, and disk I/O. Disk I/O is new in SQL 14. This can be done in a couple of ways. So the first thing that you do is that you need to create a workload. Now, a workload is, just essentially a grouping, how you're going to think about your governing your server. I strongly suggest, the admin workload so that you can always go in there and do what you need to do. Excuse me. A reporting workload, and in this case it has an OLTP workload. Or you could think of it this way. You have an admin, the accounting department, the HR department. I used to have what I called the database jail department. So if you had a really bad database, I'd put you in database jail, and it only had 10% of the server resources. Once you have those sort of workloads, then what you can do, and those can be determined by mostly, login is what I found to be the easiest, but sometimes if you have applications, app names might work as well. And then you can put importance levels on them. The OLTP workload is the high priority, your admin tasks may be low, and reports medium. Of course, I would like to put the admin tasks as high, but it's probably not good for your end user experience. Now, there's also another way to think about this. So you could think about it in groups where you give 80% of the resources to your OLTP workload, 5% to your admin, and then your ad hoc reports, get the rest. And you can set this so that, there are hard maximums, that, the admins could never use more than 5% of the server. And that's one way, that's kind of like what I consider like the simplest way to use the resource governor, is kind of thinking of it as in buckets. The other way to do it is to actually set the actual min and max memory and caps of the CPU. And so that would be if, for instance, you have an application and you want to say, I give you 50% of one CPU, or this application can use 4 CPUs. That can be done using the resource governor. So you could give very fine granular control to people if you choose to. You do have a limit of 64 resource pools, so that is something to keep in mind. I have seen databases as a service offerings with, well over 2,000 databases, and some you might just have one database on the server. It really depends on your environment. Now this is a SQL 2012 slide, but I wanted to show it in, oops, let's go back there, to show the features that a lot of database and SQL as a service use. The transparent data encryption, especially if you have high compliance needs and you're doing something that, you have a multi-tenant environment, being able to turn on data TDE, transparent data encryption, is something that a lot of people do. It protects the data. It also protects TempDB where there's shared resources. The contained database is also what makes the movability between databases possible. The goal, you can have environments that are completely contained. You might not be able to use jobs because, for instance, that requires shared information in the sysjobs, or, oh my God, the MSDB database. I was blanking there for a minute. And we'll talk about that in greater detail here in a second. I also recommend thinking about using SQL Audit, because one of the most important things you need to be able to do in one of these shared environments is prove that you didn't do something. And I like to use SQL Audit to record the activities that I did on a server so that anybody can go and see, oh, Sarah logged into this server on this date, and this is, you know. So if you had a problem, you could say, well, you were performing maintenance on this date. Using SQL Audit and sharing that with your end users, your customers, your developers, solves lots of problems when you have that sort of transparency of administration. And getting into the Contain DB. So Contain DB was, I think it was introduced in 2008 R2. Well, but what it does is it moves the authentication of a database from the SQL Server level down into the database level. And what that does is that there is no sharing of information in the system tables. Also, when you are doing things like moving data over, or when you have always-on availability groups, all the logins are inside that database so that they all move together. You can pick that database up, you can move it without having to do that, you know, where we script out the logins and then we have to match up the IDs. You don't have to do that with Contain Database. Now, in theory, that it does have a lower level of security, because with a regular SQL Server authentication, it authenticates at the SQL Server level and then again at the database level. Contain DB just authenticates at the database level. But it does have all of those benefits of being able to move the databases around. Now, Contain DB is called partially contained database because it doesn't include things like SSIS packages or you know, anything sort of outside of that database. And remember, if you have databases that require, you know, it may require CLR and you decide you don't want to support that, then this, you know, this is an 80-20 rule. You know, create environments that are friendly to this. A lot of people I know have specific servers for SSIS, and you know that might be creating an SSIS farm in itself might be a solution to that. I think so. Now that is, oh, look at that. It is. I did this. Oh, I'm very pleased with myself on the timing. So I am available to take questions if anybody has any. I know I did not get so much into the actual migration of SQL Server. And one thing I did want to share a quick story is that I was working with a customer who, you know, they had about 3,000 databases, all running SQL 2005, and they were concerned about migrating all of this to 2014. And we started to say, okay, let's go in and using the SQL Server Upgrade Advisor, we ran it against all the databases in a non, you know, production time, and we found, okay, so we have 12 databases that had an issue. And from converting from 2012 or 2005 to 2012 and finding 12 databases with an issue was sort of like astounding. And that migration there made that a lot easier because now we can automate the migration of it. And when you start thinking about, you know, how much of a challenge this is, I really suggest sort of maybe automating that SQL Server Upgrade Advisor, being able to share that with your, you know, business owners and say, okay, we ran this advisor and this is what these are the exact problems. Like I said, you might have a couple of problem databases, but the vast majority of your databases are going to upgrade without problems. So just wanted to share that with you real quick.
Thank you, Sarah. That was very interesting. There are some questions. John Hammond is asking, is there a recommended white paper or training on MicrosoftVirtualAcademy.com?
There is a white paper, and I do not have the link to that, but perhaps I could share that later. But if you do Bing it, you can, if you search for database as a server, as a service, there is a white paper on setting up a database as a service. It's pretty high level, but then again, most of the features that we talked about aren't specifically related to the SQL Server.
Ian Miller is asking, what about software as a service for data warehousing implementations. In my humble opinion, this is still something that needs to be on a physical server in order to maximize performance for both ETL and reporting purposes.
Right. For databases or for business analytics, that is a much harder problem. Just because of the nature of it, it is not, data warehouses do not tend to be multi-tenant. So as a result, it's a bigger challenge. There are companies that are specializing in this, but it is not something that I think that people can just roll out in general. This is, I think that we're really focused on the database engine. I think we'll see some changes in technology over the next few years, especially trying to sort of make business intelligence a little bit available for everybody, the changes that are coming in Azure. I think we might see some changes there, but today I would really recommend that the multi-tenancy stay in the database engine world.
And Ian has a follow-up question. Have you ever used always-on availability group for a data warehouse implementation?
I have not. But I don't want to say that to make it sound like it can't be done. I tend to focus, in my career, I focus on the database engine, OLTP workloads mostly.
I have the same problem Sarah does with questions relating to business intelligence because I don't go there. Yes. My big love. Sandra Cassis is asking, what are the disadvantages of contained databases?
I think the biggest disadvantage is that you don't have that double layer of authentication. And so you really have to make sure that your databases, that the environment, I personally feel that if you have a secure environment, this isn't a disadvantage. But for instance, if you have regulatory requirements that require you to have that 2 levels of authentication, it could be a problem. Also, if you're using Windows authentication, I don't see this as much as a problem because the authentication is passed through. But I would say I prefer, my default is to use contained database unless I can't, because I find the advantages of being able to move that database and not have to worry about those logins outweighs the potential for a problem. Remember, SQL Server is pretty secure. And I think it is really secure.
This isn't a question, it's a message that said, good, thanks, from you. Oh.
Was that my mom?
No, that's your mother's name, Eugene. And I just have one final thing, and that is that to announce that Bill Zoltan from Terramark is today's raffle winner, and headquarters will be in touch with you about the prize. Thank you all for coming. We'll see you in a couple of weeks, and I hope it's not snowing where you are. It's finally stopped in Philadelphia.